The 20th century witnessed many figures who changed the course of human history. Some brought light, leaving behind legacies of science, art, and peace. But others are forever tied to war, violence, and devastation. Among them, one man carved the darkest mark, leaving scars not only on Europe but on the entire world. A man who began with a poor childhood, carrying within him deep psychological cracks, but eventually became the manipulator of millions of hearts, leading an entire nation into darkness. His name, even today, still makes people shiver when it is spoken: Adolf Hitler. This is not merely the story of an individual. It is a lesson about the power of propaganda, of hatred, and of extremism, forces that, if left unchecked, can turn a civilized world into hell in the blink of an eye. Let us travel back in time, to uncover why a failed young man in Vienna became the darkest shadow of the 20th century. And this story begins with a childhood far from peaceful. Adolf Hitler was born on April 20, 1889, in a small town called Braun am Inn, located right on the border between Austria and Germany. The town was peaceful, but the child born there carried a fate far from ordinary. Hitler's father, Alois Hitler, was a strict customs officer. He was notorious for his temper, his harsh scolding, and for imposing his will upon his children. His mother, Clara, was the complete opposite: gentle, devoted, and endlessly loving. Inside their small family home, young Hitler grew up caught between these two extremes: the cold severity of his father, and the warm embrace of his mother. People often say that childhood can shape an entire life. For Hitler, it was a childhood filled with emotional fractures. He was not an outstanding student. In primary school, he did fairly well, even earning praise from his teachers for being intelligent. But as he grew older, his temperament began to change. Hitler preferred painting over dry academic subjects. He dreamed of becoming an artist, living in a world of creativity, free from life's rigid rules. Yet his father, Alois, insisted that his son follow in his footsteps, to become a government official. This clash led to endless family tensions. Father and son quarreled often, until eventually young Hitler sought refuge only in the arms of his mother, Clara. But fate was cruel. When Hitler was just 14, his father died suddenly of a lung hemorrhage. The shock freed him from his father's grip, but it also left a massive void in his life. He became rebellious, neglected his studies, and soon failed at school. Worse still, a few years later came the most devastating blow: his beloved mother Clara died of cancer. Hitler, only 18 at the time, was left without the only true anchor in his life. From then on, the once dreamy boy who longed to paint began to sink into despair and loneliness. People say his mother's death left a wound in his soul that never healed. A wound that would later fester into bitterness and rage against the world. Leaving his hometown, Hitler carried only a few paintings, little money, and a restless heart. He set out for Vienna, the cultural capital of Europe, with the hope of becoming an artist. But the doors of the future would soon slam shut. 1914. The first gunshots of World War I tore through the skies of Europe. The entire continent was engulfed in smoke and fire. At that time, Adolf Hitler was 25 years old, still drifting through a bleak existence in Vienna. A failed young man, destitute, who had once slept under bridges and sold cheap paintings just to survive. But now, the call of war became his escape. Hitler volunteered to join the German army. For the first time in his life, he found something he had long been missing: a sense of belonging. Despite the mud, the bitter cold, and the hail of bombs, Hitler discovered purpose and value in the trenches. Serving as a dispatch runner, he often carried messages through dangerous battlefields. He narrowly escaped death many times, and began to believe that fate had chosen him for a greater mission. But war also gave him something else: hatred. Witnessing comrades fall and his country pushed to the brink of ruin, Hitler became convinced that Germany did not deserve to lose. In his eyes, someone had to rise up and restore the stolen glory. In 1918, the war ended. Germany was defeated. The Treaty of Versailles was signed, forcing the nation to pay massive reparations, surrender territory, and reduce its army to a minimum. To the German people, it was a humiliation. To Hitler, it was an unforgivable wound. That humiliation, combined with his war experiences, transformed him. If once he had been merely a failed dreamer in the arts, now he was a man consumed by anger, hatred, and a dangerous delusion, the belief that he was destined to lead a nation. The years of World War I had shaped Hitler, turning a lost young man into someone hungry for power. And from this point forward, the road that would lead him to politics, and into the darkest chapter of the 20th century, had begun to unfold. After the war, Germany fell into chaos. Inflation skyrocketed, unemployment spread everywhere, and the people sank into misery. In this suffocating atmosphere, extremist groups sprang up like mushrooms. And it was here that Adolf Hitler found his path. In 1919, Hitler joined a small group called the German Workers' Party. At first, it was nothing more than a tiny political club, but to Hitler, it was like a stage, a place where he could test his gift for oratory. To everyone's surprise, Hitler possessed a rare talent for speech. Standing before a crowd, he transformed, his voice thundered, his eyes blazed. His arm lifted high, each word as sharp as a blade. In a society drowning in despair, those fiery words felt like a drug, igniting hope in people's hearts. Hitler did not only appeal to reason, but struck deeply at emotion. He planted the idea that Germany had not lost because it was weak, but because it had been betrayed, because enemies lurked in the shadows. He denounced the Treaty of Versailles, targeted Jews, communists, and all those he deemed responsible for the national humiliation. Thus, from a small group, Hitler transformed the German Workers' Party into a political force. In 1920, it was renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or simply, the Nazi Party. Its red flag, white circle, and black swastika were born then, a symbol that would haunt the world forever. In November 1923, Hitler took a bold step, launching a coup, later known as the Beer Hall Putsch. He and his allies stormed a hall in Munich, declaring the government overthrown. But the plan quickly collapsed. Hitler was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, yet this failure turned into a turning point. In prison, Hitler began writing Mein Kampf, My Struggle. It was not just an autobiography, but a political manifesto, laying out the extremist ideology he would later put into action: radical nationalism, hatred of Jews, and dreams of territorial expansion. Hitler served less than 9 months before being released. When he walked out of prison, he was no longer an obscure rebel, but a name known throughout Germany. Many despised him. But many others grew curious, even drawn to him. By the late 1920s, the global economic crisis erupted. The mark collapsed, millions of Germans lost their jobs. And this became fertile ground for Hitler to sow the seeds of his ideology. In his speeches, he did not speak only of hatred, but painted a glorious future, a powerful, unified Germany, standing equal to, or even dominating, other great powers. The desperate clung to those promises, and step by step, they gave Hitler their trust. From a nobody, Hitler was becoming the face of a new political movement. With a combination of propaganda, the violence of the paramilitary SA, and his mastery of mass psychology, the Nazi Party grew ever stronger. By the end of the 1920s, no one could afford to dismiss him anymore. He had shed the image of a failed dreamer, and was now walking steadily on the path toward absolute power. The storm was forming. And the world could not yet imagine that this storm would sweep away tens of millions of lives in the decade to come. After the failed coup of 1923, Hitler realized something crucial: if he wanted to seize power completely, he could not rely on street violence alone. Instead, he had to conquer both the minds and the votes of the German people. From 1924 to 1929, Hitler and the Nazi Party quietly rebuilt their strength. They expanded propaganda, exploiting the resentment of millions plunged into hardship by the economic crisis. Hitler's speeches echoed in public halls, enthralling crowds with promises of a strong, united Germany that would break the chains of the Versailles Treaty. Then, a fateful event opened the door: the Great Depression of 1929. As banks collapsed and unemployment spread like wildfire, millions of Germans fell into despair. Hitler emerged as a savior, pointing to imagined enemies, Jews, communists, a weak government, and instilling the belief that only the Nazis could restore Germany. By 1930, the Nazi Party, once a fringe group, had won more than 100 seats in parliament. 2 years later, the number soared, making them one of the largest parties. Hitler, once a political outsider, was now at the center of every debate. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. But for him, holding a title was not enough. In February 1933, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, suddenly went up in flames. Hitler and his government immediately blamed the communists. Within days, the Reichstag fire decree was issued, stripping away freedoms of the press, assembly, and allowing arrests of anyone deemed a threat. The climax came with the Enabling Act in March 1933, granting Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary approval. This was the historic turning point. From a chancellor by appointment, Hitler had transformed himself into a dictator with absolute authority. Step by step, he had turned Germany into his personal instrument. And from here, the world was about to enter its darkest days. September 1, 1939. Cannons roared along the Polish border, heralding the beginning of an unprecedented nightmare. The Nazi army, with its blitzkrieg, lightning war, stormed forward, crushing every defense. Within weeks, Poland was wiped from the map, and humanity realized, a new war, fiercer than the First World War, had begun. Britain and France declared war on Germany. But instead of halting Hitler, they were dragged into the whirlwind. In the spring of 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway, and within just 6 weeks, France, a great European power, collapsed completely. The Nazi flag flew over Paris. The whole continent trembled in terror. Yet Hitler did not stop. He turned his eyes to Britain, the last barrier to his dream of dominating Europe. Over London, thousands of German planes rained bombs without rest. Night after night, civilians huddled in shelters, listening to explosions above. But in that darkness, the British people stood firm, and Prime Minister Winston Churchill vowed they would never surrender. In 1941, Hitler made a bold, and fatal, move, invading the Soviet Union. Millions of German soldiers poured into the vast lands, believing the Red Army would fall easily. But Russia's brutal winter, and the fierce resistance of its people, turned the conquest into a bloody catastrophe. That same year, another front opened. On December 7, 1941, Japan, Germany's ally, launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was devastated. But the strike brought America, an economic and military giant, into the war. From then on, World War II became a truly global conflict. In the following years, the world witnessed battles of unimaginable scale: Stalingrad, El Alamein, Normandy. Millions perished, an entire generation consumed by fire and steel. Once thriving cities were reduced to ashes. And alongside the battlefields, a darker shadow fell across Europe, the shadow of concentration camps. Millions of Jews, along with many other peoples and groups, were herded into them, where only despair and silent death awaited. This was one of humanity's most horrific crimes. At last, after immense sacrifice, the balance of war tipped toward the Allies. In 1945, Soviet troops stormed into Berlin, gunfire echoing through the German capital. Hitler, the man who once dreamed of ruling the world, was now cornered in his bunker, where his fate would end in tragedy. World War II ended, but the price humanity paid was immeasurable: more than 70 million lives lost, and the world left scarred forever by this nightmare. In the midst of the war, a horrific crime was concealed beneath the veil of propaganda slogans and military campaigns. People called it by a haunting name: the Holocaust. This was not just about dry numbers. It was the story of millions of human beings: Jews, Romani people, the disabled, political prisoners, and many other minority groups, who were deemed unworthy of existence. From 1941, a network of concentration and extermination camps was built across Europe. There, innocent people were imprisoned in hunger, forced into exhausting labor, and then sent into cold, airless gas chambers. They walked inside, holding on to a faint hope of being given a shower, but within minutes the entire room was engulfed in deadly silence. The Holocaust was not only the destruction of bodies. It was the destruction of humanity itself. Millions of families torn apart, millions of dreams extinguished before they could even blossom. When the war finally neared its end, the world was horrified to discover the scale of this crime. The photographs and films taken in camps such as Auschwitz, Treblinka, Dachau became terrifying evidence that forced mankind to ask, how could a civilized society descend to such depths? The Holocaust has left a wound that can never fully heal in history. It reminds us that extremism and hatred, once nurtured and fueled, can turn the world into a living hell on earth. April 1945. Berlin was no longer the proud capital of Germany. It had become a sea of rubble, fire, and gunfire. Streets lay in ruins, buildings reduced to piles of bricks. The Soviet Red Army had encircled the city from all sides. The people of Berlin lived in absolute fear, afraid of the bombs above, and of what would happen when the Allies finally broke through. Meanwhile, underground, in a concrete bunker nearly 10 meters deep, Adolf Hitler, along with his guards and closest followers, clung desperately to power. He refused to leave Berlin, believing that Germany would either triumph with him or collapse with him. In those final days, Hitler was barely a shadow of the man who once delivered fiery speeches to hundreds of thousands. He was thin, trembling, his eyes filled with panic. Eyewitness diaries recount how he paced endlessly through the dim bunker, issuing commands to imaginary divisions, armies that had long since disintegrated at the front. On April 29, Hitler married Eva Braun, the woman who had stood beside him for many years, in a small, hurried ceremony right inside the bunker. Only a day later, on April 30, 1945, Hitler decided to end it all. In a small room, he and Eva both took cyanide poison. Hitler then shot himself in the head. The gunshot echoed through the bunker, ending the life of the man who had thrown the world into turmoil. Their bodies were carried outside by guards to the garden of the Reich Chancellery. Doused in gasoline, and set aflame, in accordance with Hitler's own orders. Above ground, the Red Army's guns thundered. Berlin fell. Within days, Germany officially surrendered unconditionally. The death of Hitler was not just the end of a man, but the collapse of a regime, a nightmare that had cast its shadow over humanity. Yet the pain, the destruction, and the scars he left behind could not be erased overnight. That downfall reminds us of one truth: absolute power, when built upon extremism and hatred, will always end in tragedy. Adolf Hitler was dead. The empire he built had collapsed with him. But what remained after the Second World War was not only a devastated Germany, it was hard-earned lessons for all of humanity. The story of Hitler is not only the tragedy of one nation, but also a warning to the world, about the dangerous power of extremism, of ideologies that spread hatred, and of a single individual entrusted with absolute power. Looking back, we see that Hitler did not create the catastrophe alone. He rose out of crisis, out of the anger and discontent of society. It was fear, despair, and the loss of trust that opened the path for him. And when the masses entrusted power to an extremist, the entire world paid the price. More than 70 years have passed, yet the shadows of war and the Holocaust still remain etched in human memory. They remind us that peace, tolerance, and human rights are never to be taken for granted. We must always stay vigilant, always cherish them, always defend them. Hitler's life ended in a cold, dark bunker, but the catastrophic legacy he left still haunts humanity to this day. And perhaps the greatest message history leaves us is this: one individual can change the entire world, but whether the world changes for better or for worse depends on the choices of us all.